June 1944, northern Saipan. Night settles over the jagged cliffs and tangled jungle, where pockets of exhausted Japanese soldiers hide inside caves carved deep into volcanic rock. The air is thick with humidity and gunpowder. The wounded whisper in the darkness. Officers grip their rifles, preparing for another American assault at dawn. No one expects mercy. No one expects words. Then it happens. A low hum rolls across the valley, followed by a crackle of electricity. Moments later, a deep, unfamiliar voice booms through the night, not in English, but in perfect Japanese. The sound echoes off the cliffs, vibrating through the cave walls. Your situation is hopeless. Do not throw away your lives. Come out, and you will be treated. The soldiers freeze. Some think it's a trick. Some think it's a ghost. Others stare wide-eyed, unable to comprehend how the enemy is speaking to them in their own tongue. Whispers ripple through the cave. Men who believe surrender meant dishonor feel their resolve tremble. For the first time, they hear something more powerful than rifles or grenades. They hear the voice of an enemy asking them to live. And nothing in their training prepared them for this. Long before Japanese soldiers heard American voices echoing through the jungles and caves of the Pacific, the two nations approached warfare with fundamentally different cultural expectations. For the Japanese Imperial Army, surrender was not simply discouraged, it was forbidden. Rooted in centuries of warrior tradition, the Bushido ethos demanded unwavering loyalty, endurance, and death before dishonor. Training manuals reinforced this belief. Officers lectured their men that capture meant shame to their families. Propaganda warned that Americans tortured prisoners, making surrender seem worse than death. This doctrine shaped the early Pacific battles. At Guadalcanal, Buna, and Tarawa, Japanese forces fought to the last man, launching desperate charges even when outnumbered and outgunned. American commanders quickly realized they faced an enemy unlike those in Europe, one that preferred annihilation over capitulation. Leaflet drops encouraging surrender were usually burned, ignored, or treated as enemy tricks. Psychological warfare, as used in Europe, had little initial effect in the Pacific, but the Americans were learning. Reports from Marines and Army infantry described cave networks packed with starving, wounded Japanese soldiers who refused to emerge. Engineers blasted entrances with explosives. Flamethrower teams burned out tunnels. Casualties on both sides were horrific. Commanders began to ask a pressing question: was there a way to reduce the slaughter? By 1943, the U.S. military began studying Japanese culture more carefully. Linguists, intelligence officers, and Nisei interpreters, second-generation Japanese Americans, provided insight into the psychological barriers preventing surrender. They explained the power of shame, the fear of retaliation from one's own officers, and the belief that Americans offered no safety to prisoners. They also clarified that the Japanese language itself carried nuances that written leaflets could not easily express. This understanding led to a new idea, one that had rarely been used in the Pacific before: spoken persuasion. Early experiments involved handheld loudspeakers carried by infantry squads attempting to communicate with isolated Japanese positions. Results were limited, but promising. Some small groups surrendered after hearing assurances spoken clearly in their own tongue. Others hesitated, shaken by the unfamiliar concept of an enemy urging mercy rather than death. American commanders realized the potential. If loudspeakers could undermine the no-surrender ethos, they could save thousands of lives, both American and Japanese. But success required more than simply speaking words. It demanded powerful equipment, accurate translation, cultural sensitivity, and precise timing on the battlefield. It required technology capable of cutting through jungle, echoing across cliffs, and reaching deep into cave systems. And so the stage was set for one of the most unusual and transformative tactics of the Pacific War, one in which the loudest weapon on the battlefield was not artillery, but a voice carried through metal horns. By early 1944, the United States military formalized its growing interest in battlefield persuasion. The psychological warfare branch, already active in Europe, began coordinating with commanders in the Pacific to adapt loudspeaker operations to conditions unlike any other theater of the war. Instead of dense cities or open plains, American forces faced volcanic ridges, deep jungle, coral cliffs, and intricate cave networks fortified by Japanese engineers. To reach hidden troops, the Americans needed power, clarity, and range. Engineering battalions and communications specialists began modifying standard amplifiers into rugged field systems. They mounted loudspeakers on jeeps, armored vehicles, landing craft, and even aircraft. Power units were reinforced to survive humidity and monsoon rains. Signal teams built waterproof wiring, elevated platforms, and portable metal horns, capable of projecting sound across valleys and into tunnel entrances. But the real key to success was language. Nisei linguists, many of whom had been interned with their family in the United States, became essential to the mission. Their fluency allowed them to craft messages that struck psychological pressure points. They avoided direct commands that would provoke resistance, and instead used culturally specific phrasing, appeals, to protect one's life for the emperor's post-war needs. Reassurances that prisoners would receive food, water, and medical care. Descriptions of hopeless tactical situations confirming that further resistance was futile. Voices of captured Japanese soldiers verifying humane treatment for Japanese troops indoctrinated since childhood. Hearing Japanese Americans, fluent, respectful, yet working for the enemy, created profound confusion. Some believed these voices belonged to ghosts or spirits. Others suspected trickery, yet many felt the first cracks in their resolve. Because the messages carried emotional authenticity leaflets could never achieve. Technologically, loudspeaker operations expanded rapidly. On Saipan, teams used amplifiers mounted atop trucks to reach soldiers in ravines. In the Philippines, systems were fixed to patrol boats broadcasting across river banks. On Okinawa, massive 1,000-watt speakers were hauled up cliffs to address thousands of trapped defenders. American commanders saw the results. Night attacks decreased, surrenders increased in small but meaningful numbers. Entire pockets of resistance hesitated instead of charging blindly toward death. This was not merely a tactical innovation. It was a cultural and psychological confrontation, unlike anything the Pacific had seen, because, for the first time, Japanese soldiers heard something their military doctrine never prepared them to face: an enemy asking them to choose life. This growing shift, subtle, uneven, but undeniable, set the stage for the dramatic encounters that would soon unfold as American loudspeaker teams confronted entrenched Japanese troops, determined to fight to the last breath. For Japanese soldiers trained to believe Americans were ruthless, faceless enemies, the first time they heard a calm, confident voice speaking perfect Japanese through a loudspeaker felt surreal. Many described the moment as disorienting, a crack in the psychological wall that had held their morale in place for years. Inside caves and bunkers, men froze mid-motion. Some instinctively reached for their rifles, expecting a trick. Others exchanged nervous glances, unable to reconcile the booming voice with everything they had been taught. The messages did not sound threatening. They were soft, measured, and delivered in a tone unfamiliar on a battlefield. They offered water, medical treatment, the chance to see families again. Concepts that had been erased from the minds of soldiers conditioned for death. Hearing the enemy speak not as a monster, but as a human being, forced a confrontation with the reality the Imperial Army had hidden. Surrender was possible, and survival did not equal dishonor. For many, this emotional shock became the first step toward surrender. Not because the voice commanded them, but because it shook their certainty. Bushed had taught them to embrace death. The loudspeaker asked them to imagine life, and in the darkness of jungle caves, that question became louder than the war itself. While loudspeakers carried emotional weight, their tactical purpose was clear: reduce casualties by persuading isolated Japanese units to surrender or, at minimum, hesitate. In islands dominated by caves and ravines, direct assault was deadly. Americans often faced defenders who refused to retreat even when surrounded. Loudspeaker teams offered an alternative approach that blended persuasion with battlefield awareness. Commanders deployed loudspeakers in coordinated sequences. Before an attack, messages warned Japanese troops about the overwhelming American force about to advance. During firefights, they reassured defenders that surrender would be accepted safely. At night, they disrupted planned banzai charges by flooding the jungle with sound. Messages echoed off cliffs, making origin points impossible to locate, a deliberate tactic to protect the speaker crews. In some operations, tanks equipped with turret-mounted speakers approached cave openings under covering fire. Infantry protected Linguists as they broadcast surrender appeals. After minutes of silence, Japanese soldiers sometimes emerged waving white cloths made from torn shirts. In other cases, the loudspeakers forced them deeper into caves, making flamethrower assaults easier and safer. The Americans quickly realized the strategic value of hesitation. Even if the Japanese did not surrender, the few seconds of confusion created by hearing their own language from an unexpected source often disrupted their defensive rhythm. Hesitation could mean survival for both sides. Thus, the loudspeaker evolved into a tactical instrument, one capable of reshaping battlefield momentum without firing a single shot. The Pacific theater presented immense technical challenges. Dense jungles absorbed sound, caves distorted echoes, monsoon rains drenched electrical equipment. Standard European loudspeaker systems were too weak, too delicate, or too directional for island warfare. The solution came from U.S. Signal Corps engineers, who redesigned equipment specifically for harsh Pacific conditions. They created portable amplifier units with reinforced casings, moisture-resistant wiring, and power supplies that could run from vehicle batteries, gasoline generators, or hand-cranked units. Metal horn speakers, some nearly a meter long, projected sound across ravines and through narrow cave mouths. Jeep-mounted systems allowed mobility, while tank-mounted speakers offered armored protection for linguists broadcasting at close range. Specialized cave persuasion teams carried compact handheld megaphones for risky, close-quarters negotiations. Naval units mounted loudspeakers on landing craft to reach defenders before amphibious assaults. Aircraft even conducted aerial broadcast, though wind and engine noise limited their effectiveness. The most effective systems were high-wattage setups positioned on cliffs or ridgelines. These delivered powerful, resonant broadcasts in Japanese, sometimes audible across entire valleys. Many Japanese troops later recalled the unnatural clarity of these voices echoing through the jungle. The sound pierced through the darkness, cutting across the noise of battle and reaching soldiers who believed no message could penetrate their defenses. These systems were more than equipment. They were engineered instruments of psychological influence, a merging of technology and human language that reshaped the Pacific battlefield in ways Japanese soldiers could never have foreseen. One of the most effective elements of the American loudspeaker strategy was the use of voices that Japanese soldiers trusted, the voices of their own comrades, prisoners of war who were willing to cooperate, along with Nisei linguists fluent in regional dialects, became essential tools in persuasion. Their speech patterns, tones, and cultural references carried weight that scripted messages could never match. Intelligence officers carefully coached these speakers. They did not command surrender outright. Doing so could provoke resistance due to cultural pride. Instead, they emphasized the hopelessness of the situation, the promise of humane treatment, and the value of staying alive for the emperor's future. Sometimes, captured soldiers described how respectfully they had been treated by Americans, countering the terrifying myths spread by Japanese propaganda. Hearing these voices rattled the defenders. Men trapped in caves whispered among themselves, was it possible the Americans were not murderers? Could surrender be survivable? Those who recognized dialects from their home prefectures felt a deeper internal conflict. If someone from their own province had surrendered and lived, what did that mean for them? The loudspeakers also conveyed intelligence subtly. They referenced depleted Japanese units, encirclement, or impending bombardment, information only a well-informed enemy could know. This left defenders shaken, questioning how much the Americans understood. These broadcasts cut through isolation. They implanted doubt. And in warfare, doubt is sometimes more powerful than firepower. American commanders in the Pacific learned through brutal experience that attacking fortified Japanese positions cost thousands of lives. Every cave assault meant dead infantrymen, burned flamethrower operators, and defenders who refused to yield even when mortally wounded. The U.S. military began to understand something profound. The battle for territory could not be separated from the battle for the mind. Thus, psychological warfare became a deliberate strategy, not an auxiliary one. The objective was not simply to terrify the enemy, but to widen the mental space between individual Japanese soldiers and the rigid ideology that bound them to suicidal defense. Psychological warfare officers studied Japanese cultural expectations of honor, obedience, and shame. They learned which phrases eased fear, which implied respect, and which shifted perception without triggering ideological backlash. They crafted messages that allowed Japanese soldiers to surrender without feeling they had abandoned their duty, reframing survival as a contribution to Japan's future. The American philosophy was pragmatic. If 50 Japanese soldiers surrendered, 50 Americans would not die fighting them. If 500 hesitated to charge, 500 Marines might survive. Every voice broadcast through a speaker was a potential life saved. This was warfare measured not only in ground gained, but in casualties avoided, a strategy based on preserving life rather than extinguishing it. The use of loudspeakers exposed deep moral complexities on both sides. Japanese soldiers who wanted to surrender risked execution by their own officers. Some feared that coming out would dishonor their family. Others feared reprisals after hearing years of propaganda portraying Americans as merciless. For American loudspeaker teams, the ethical challenge was different. They knew that failure to persuade meant those same soldiers would likely die, often gruesomely, against flamethrowers, grenades, or artillery. Each broadcast carried the weight of life or death consequences. Linguists placed themselves in exposed positions, sometimes within rifle range of desperate defenders, to deliver messages that might spare lives. Yet psychological warfare was not universally welcomed by all American troops. Some frontline units, hardened by bitter fighting, doubted whether the enemy deserved such mercy. Others feared the broadcast might embolden trickery or lead to ambushes. The battlefield blurred moral lines. Saving an enemy soldier might save an American too, but it required trusting that the enemy would act rationally in irrational circumstances. And then there was the Japanese perspective, torn between conditioning and instinct. Some soldiers secretly longed to live, whispering privately about surrender. Others seethed with anger at the idea, viewing the loudspeaker's message as an insult. A few took their own lives rather than face the unbearable conflict between ideology and survival. This moral tension, between duty, fear, compassion, and the basic human will to live, set the stage for the dramatic turning point when loudspeakers changed the outcome of real battles. June 1944, Northern Saipan. Near the cliffs of Marpi Point, American forces have spent days battling entrenched Japanese defenders hidden inside cave networks, carved into the volcanic ridges. The terrain is brutal. Marines attempting direct assaults face machine gun fire, grenades dropped from above, and traps laid deep within the tunnels. Casualties mount. The smell of cordite and burnt vegetation hangs heavy in the air. The Americans pause their attacks. Something different is about to begin. A team from the psychological warfare branch to Nisei linguist, a signal corps technician, and a Marine security squad climbs a rocky slope carrying a heavy 1,000-watt loudspeaker. They set it atop a flat ledge overlooking a ravine, where Japanese defenders are believed to be hiding. The sun begins to set, casting long shadows across the battlefield. The jungle quiets. From inside the caves, Japanese soldiers wait for another flamethrower assault. They tighten their grips on rifles slick with sweat. Officers whisper final orders. No one speaks of surrender. It is a word that has no place here. Then a deep hum fills the valley. Metal crackle. A click echoes across the cliffs. And suddenly a voice. Clear. Confident. Speaking perfect Japanese. Soldiers of the Emperor. Your position is surrounded. Your officers cannot save you. Those who surrender will receive water, food, and medical care. Step forward with hands raised. The defenders stiffen. Some curse under their breath. Others stare toward the cave entrance in disbelief. The voice continues, this time softer, almost pleading. Your families want you to live. The war will not end today, but your life does not need to end here. A private near the back of the cave feels his resolve crack. He has not eaten properly in days. His wounds throb. He thinks of his mother in Hiroshima, the promises he made before leaving home. He whispers to a friend, they speak like us. But an officer shuts him down, threatening to shoot anyone who moves toward the entrance. Outside, the loudspeaker team shifts tactic. A second voice comes on, younger, shaken, unmistakably Japanese. It belongs to a recently captured soldier who agreed to speak voluntarily. I surrendered yesterday. They treated my wounds. I am alive. The Americans are not monsters. You will not be harmed. This message sends a shock through the cave. For the first time, fear and hope collide. The officer at the front trembles with rage, ordering silence. But his commands no longer carry the same authority. Whispers spread. Doubt spreads. Some men begin to question everything they had been taught. The Americans repeat the message. The sun dips below the horizon. Darkness fills the valley, amplifying every word. Hours pass. The loudspeaker falls silent. The Japanese soldiers sit in the oppressive stillness, minds racing, torn between indoctrination and instinct. And then, as midnight approaches, something incredible happens, a sound the Americans were not expecting, yet hoping desperately to hear. A single voice calls from inside the cave. A hesitant, trembling voice. Want to come out? The Marines look at one another. The moment is fragile. And everything now depends on what happens next. The Marine security team freezes, unsure whether the voice from the cave is genuine or a trap. Night operations on Saipan had already taught them to expect deception, sudden banzai charges, hidden grenades, booby-trapped bodies. But the tone of this call is not aggressive. It is weary. It is afraid. It is unmistakably human. The lead Nisei linguist steps forward carefully. He raises the microphone again, his voice steady, carrying across the rocks. Walk slowly, hands visible, no weapons. You will not be harmed. For several long seconds, nothing happens. The ravine remains silent except for the distant pop of sporadic gunfire elsewhere on the island. The Marines grip their rifles tighter. A spotlight sweeps the cave mouth, illuminating dust suspended in the humid air. Then movement. A silhouette appears. A thin figure in a tattered uniform limps forward, hands raised. His face is gaunt, eyes sunken, but alive. Behind him, more shapes emerge, hesitant, shaking, stepping into the moonlight like men waking from a nightmare. 5. 10. 20. One by one, they walk toward the Americans, some whispering one eshimasu, please, others bowing instinctively. Some cry openly. Many stare at the Marines in disbelief, as if expecting to be shot at any moment. Instead, medics move forward with canteens, bandages, and blankets. The surrender is real. But inside the cave, not everyone agrees. A furious Japanese officer shouts threats, raises his pistol, and orders the rest to return. His voice echoes violently through the tunnel. Several soldiers recoil, others stand frozen, torn between fear of their superior and the unimaginable sight of comrades walking safely toward the enemy. The loudspeaker crackles back to life. Your officers will force you to die. You do not have to follow them. Your life belongs to you, and you can save it. The officer fires a shot into the ceiling, screaming for obedience. Dust rains down, but the shot backfires. Instead of restoring discipline, it breaks it completely. Soldiers scatter deeper into the cave, refusing to follow him. A few, trembling, drop their rifles and run toward the entrance. The psychological wall has collapsed. Outside, The Americans gently guide the emerging prisoners to a secured area. Many of the Japanese expect torture or humiliation. Instead, they are given water. One Marine even lights a cigarette for a captured sergeant who stares at him, as though witnessing something impossible. The loudspeaker team prepares another broadcast. But something unexpected happens. A Japanese soldier, newly surrendered, asks to speak. The Marines exchange cautious glances and eventually hand him the microphone. His voice, weak but sincere, echoes into the darkness. "Brothers, come out. There is nothing left here but death. Live, please live." Inside the cave, a stunned silence follows. This is not propaganda, not manipulation. It is the voice of one of their own. Minutes later, another wave of soldiers emerges, then another. Eventually, more than 100 men surrender, far more than any American commander had believed possible. The officer who resisted retreats deeper into the tunnels, choosing death over capitulation. But the majority have chosen life. When dawn breaks over Saipan, the battlefield looks different. Not because the guns have fallen silent, but because a new kind of weapon has revealed its power. A weapon that required no bullets, no explosion, only a voice. The Marines pack their equipment. The linguists wipe sweat and dust from their faces. And they all know they have witnessed something extraordinary, a moment when psychological warfare changed the outcome of a battle and challenged the deepest beliefs of soldiers who had been taught never to surrender. The surrender at Saipan did not end the battle, far from it. Fighting raged across the island for weeks, but news of what happened in the cave spread quickly through American units. Marines and Army soldiers, hardened by months of close quarters combat, were stunned that loudspeakers, simple metal horns powered by generators, could achieve what grenades and flamethrowers often could not. For commanders, the implications were immediate. If psychological warfare could convince even a fraction of Japanese troops to surrender, then thousands of American lives might be saved across the Pacific. And just as important, countless Japanese soldiers, starving, wounded, trapped in hopeless positions, could be spared the fate their doctrine demanded. Soon, psychological warfare teams became a regular part of cave-clearing operations on Guam. Broadcast units followed infantry advances, urging small pockets of defenders to surrender rather than launch suicidal attacks. In the Philippines, Japanese stragglers hiding in mountain ranges hesitated after hearing loudspeaker messages announcing the fall of Japanese stronghold. On Peleliu, some defenders emerged after days of broadcast, ending their resistance before the island's final, brutal assaults. But Japanese reactions were not uniform. Some soldiers, deeply loyal to their officers or terrified of dishonor, chose death over surrender. Others fled deeper into caves, convinced the broadcast were tricks designed to lure them into traps. A few attempted to ambush loudspeaker teams, leading Marines to assign additional riflemen for protection. Still, the shift was undeniable. American units reported noticeable drops in night assaults, fewer last-ditch charges, and more individual surrenders than earlier in the war. Even small psychological victories had massive tactical meaning. Every soldier who surrendered was one less defender to face in a cave, one less man launching a bayonet charge, one less casualty added to a battle already defined by staggering losses. Captured diaries revealed how deeply the loudspeaker messages disturbed Japanese troops. Some wrote of hearing voices floating in the darkness, urging them to live. Others described the shock of learning that captured comrades received medical care and humane treatment, an idea that contradicted everything their officers taught. A few admitted they had wanted to surrender long before the loudspeakers ever spoke, but fear of their own leadership held them back. The Americans realized something profound. Their enemy was not made of fanaticism alone, but of men capable of doubt, fear, and hope. As psychological warfare gained traction, the U.S. invested more resources. Loudspeaker units received better equipment, stronger amplifiers, and dedicated training. Messages were refined to address cultural nuances, battlefield conditions, and emotional cues. By late 1944, the tactic was no longer an experiment. It was doctrine. And nowhere would its impact be felt more dramatically than in the final island. Campaigns to come, Okinawa, Iwo Jima, and the scattered pockets across the Philippines, where thousands of Japanese soldiers still clung to caves believing surrender was impossible. The Americans were preparing to prove otherwise. The surrender at Saipan did not end the battle. Far from it. Fighting raged across the island for weeks, but news of what happened in the cave spread quickly through American units. Marines and Army soldiers, hardened by months of close-quarters combat, were stunned that loudspeakers, simple metal horns powered by generators, could achieve what grenades and flamethrowers often could not. For commanders, the implications were immediate. If psychological warfare could convince even a fraction of Japanese troops to surrender, then thousands of American lives might be saved across the Pacific. And just as important, countless Japanese soldiers, starving, wounded, trapped in hopeless positions, could be spared the fate their doctrine demanded. Soon, psychological warfare teams became a regular part of cave-clearing operations on Guam. Broadcast units followed infantry advances, urging small pockets of defenders to surrender rather than launch suicidal attacks. In the Philippines, Japanese stragglers hiding in mountain ranges hesitated after hearing loudspeaker messages announcing the fall of Japanese stronghold. On Peleliu, some defenders emerged after days of broadcast, ending their resistance before the island's final, brutal assaults. But Japanese reactions were not uniform. Some soldiers, deeply loyal to their officers or terrified of dishonor, chose death over surrender. Others fled deeper into caves, convinced the broadcast were tricks designed to lure them into traps. A few attempted to ambush loudspeaker teams, leading Marines to assign additional riflemen for protection. Still, the shift was undeniable. American units reported noticeable drops in night assaults, fewer last-ditch charges, and more individual surrenders than earlier in the war. Even small psychological victories had massive tactical meaning. Every soldier who surrendered was one less defender to face in a cave, one less man launching a bayonet charge, one less casualty added to a battle already defined by staggering losses. Captured diaries revealed how deeply the loudspeaker messages disturbed Japanese troops. Some wrote of hearing voices floating in the darkness, urging them to live. Others described the shock of learning that captured comrades received medical care and humane treatment, an idea that contradicted everything their officers taught. A few admitted they had wanted to surrender long before the loudspeakers ever spoke, but fear of their own leadership held them back. The Americans realized something profound. Their enemy was not made of fanaticism alone, but of men capable of doubt, fear, and hope. As psychological warfare gained traction, the U.S. invested more resources. Loudspeaker units received better equipment, stronger amplifiers, and dedicated training. Messages were refined to address cultural nuances, battlefield conditions, and emotional cues. By late 1944, the tactic was no longer an experiment. It was doctrine, and nowhere would its impact be felt more dramatically than in the final island campaigns to come: Okinawa, Iwo Jima, and the scattered pockets across the Philippines, where thousands of Japanese soldiers still clung to caves believing surrender was impossible. The Americans were preparing to prove otherwise. In a war remembered for its ferocity, its fanaticism, and its staggering human cost, it is striking that some of the most decisive moments came not from artillery or tanks, but from voices carried across the battlefield. The story of American loudspeakers in the Pacific is not simply a tale of technology or tactics. It is a reminder of the profound psychological dimension of war, where the mind can be as contested as the ground beneath it. For Japanese soldiers conditioned to choose death over capture, the broadcasts were more than strange sounds from the enemy. They were a fracture in the ideology that shaped their world. Hearing their own language spoken with calm assurance, hearing promises of humanity instead of annihilation, forced them to confront choices they had been taught never to consider. In that moment, their enemy was no longer an abstract, monstrous figure. He was a voice offering life for the American. These broadcasts reveal the truth often overshadowed by battlefield violence: that saving lives, even enemy lives, could be a strategic act of compassion. Persuasion became a tool that spared soldiers the agony of close-quarters assaults, and spared Japanese troops a death they no longer believed was necessary. It offered a way to break the cycle of annihilation that defines so many island battles. And for history, these events illuminate the quiet, human currents that run beneath even the most brutal conflicts. They show that war, despite all its destruction, is fought by individuals, men with fears, doubts, hopes, and families waiting far away. When loudspeakers echoed across the jungles and cliffs of the Pacific, they did more than demand surrender. They bridged a cultural abyss, if only for moments, allowing sworn enemies to share the universal instinct to survive. In the end, these voices did not end the war, but they reminded everyone who heard them that beyond ideology and orders, there remains something deeper: the simple and enduring value of a human life.